Welcome to Reading with Rashonda. We are still reading Clotel by William Wells Brown, and we are at Chapter 4. Chapter 4, The Quadroon's Home. How sweetly on the hillside sleeps the sunlight with its quickening rays. The verdant trees that crown the steeps grow greener in its quivering blaze. About 3 miles from Richmond is a pleasant plain with here and there a beautiful cottage surrounded by trees so as scarcely to be seen. Among them was one far retired from the public roads and almost hidden among the trees. It was a perfect model of rural beauty. The piazzas that surrounded it were covered with clematis and passion flower. The pride of China mixed its oriental-looking foliage with the majestic magnolia, and the air was redolent with the fragrance of flowers peeping out of every nook and nodding upon you with the most unexpected welcome. The tasteful hand of art had not learned to imitate the lavish beauty and harmonious disorder of nature, but they lived together in loving amity and spoke in accordant tones. The gateway rose in a Gothic arch with graceful tracery and ironwork, surmounted by a cross, round which fluttered and played the mountain fringe, that lightest and most fragile of vines. This cottage was hired by Horatio Green for Clotel, and the quadroon girl soon found herself in her new home. That just sounded weird to me, right? This cottage was hired by Horatio Green for Clotel, and the quadroon girl soon found herself in her new home. Not their home? Are they married? What happened? We didn't get all of the deets on this. All right, let's keep reading. The tenderness of Clotel's conscience, together with the care her mother had with her and the high value she placed upon virtue, required an outward marriage. Though she well knew that a union with her proscribed race was unrecognized by law, and therefore the ceremony would give her no legal hold on Horatio's constancy. But her high poetic nature regarded reality rather than the semblance of things. Let's look at that again. She required an outward marriage because she knew somebody of her race, black, couldn't legally be married to somebody of Horatio's race, white. And the ceremony would give her no legal hold on Horatio's constancy. Let's just keep that in mind. And when he playfully asked how she could keep him if he wished to run away, what? Who playfully asks that? Sorry, let's keep reading. My bad. She replied, "If the mutual love we have for each other, and the dictates of your own conscience do not cause you to remain my husband, and your affections fall from me, I would not, if I could, hold you by a single fetter." It was indeed a marriage sanctioned by heaven, although unrecognized on earth. There the young couple lived secluded from the world, and passed their time as happily as circumstances would permit. It was Clotel's wish that Horatio should purchase her mother and sister, but the young man pleaded that he was unable, owing to the fact that he had not come into possession of his share of property. Yet he promised that when he did, he would seek them out and purchase them. That's all I'm saying about that. Their firstborn was Mary, and her complexion was still lighter than her mother. Indeed, she was not darker than other white children. As the child grew older, it more and more resembled its mother. The iris of her large dark eye had the melting mezzotinto, which remains the last vestige of African ancestry, and gives that plaintive expression so often observed and so appropriate to that docile and injured race. Clotel was still happier after the birth of her dear child, for Horatio, as might have been expected, was often absent day and night with his friends in the city. Why is he often absent day and night with his friends in the city? It doesn't say on business, it says with his friends in the city. I'm sorry, I'm gonna keep reading. Where was I? I got all jacked up. All right. For Horatio, as might have been expected, was often absent day and night with his friends in the city, and the edicts of society had built up a wall of separation between the quadroon and them. Happy as Clotel was in Horatio's love, and surrounded by an outward environment of beauty so well adapted to her poetic spirit, she felt these incidents with inexpressible pain. For herself she cared but little, for she had found a sheltered home in Horatio's heart which the world might ridicule but had no power to profane. But when she looked at her beloved Mary and reflected upon the unavoidable and dangerous position which the tyranny of society had awarded her, her soul was filled with anguish. So, while this is not a typical plissage relationship that we talked about before, because plissage relationships were between white men and free women of color, this is laid out exactly like one of those relationships. The man gets a house for the placé, he takes care of her, they have kids, but they're never together in society. They are totally separate. And now at this point, because Clotel is his property, he bought her, remember, she is a slave. Their daughter is also a slave. Why didn't he free her? I don't know. Maybe well, actually, I know he didn't, because I remember the book. I'm not trying to ruin it for you. But they never said anything about him freeing her. Just he purchased her and he married her. And now they have a little bambina named Mary, and Clotel is worried about Mary's future. But when she looked at her beloved Mary and reflected upon the unavoidable and dangerous position which the tyranny of society had awarded her, her soul was filled with anguish. The rare loveliness of the child increased daily and was evidently ripening into most marvelous beauty. The father seemed to rejoice in it with unmingled pride, but in the deep tenderness of the mother's eye there was an indwelling sadness that spoke of anxious thoughts and fearful foreboding. Clotel now urged Horatio to remove to France or England, where both her and her child would be free, and where color was not a crime. This request excited but little opposition, and was so attractive to his imagination that he might have overcome all intervening obstacles, had not a change come over the spirit of his dreams. He still loved Clotel, but he was now becoming engaged in political and other affairs which kept him oftener and longer from the young mother, and ambition to become a statesman was slowly gaining the ascendancy over him. Among those on whom Horatio's political success most depended was a very popular and wealthy man who had an only daughter. His visits to the house were at first purely of a political nature, but the young lady was pleasing, and he fancied he discovered in her a sort of timid preference for himself. This excited his vanity and awakened thoughts of the great worldly advantages connected with the union. Reminiscences of his first love kept these vague ideas in check for several months, for with it was associated the idea of restraint. Moreover, Gertrude, though inferior in beauty, was yet a pretty contrast to her rival. Her light hair fell in silken ringlets down her shoulders. Her blue eyes were gentle though inexpressive, and her healthy cheeks were like opening rosebuds. He had already become accustomed to the dangerous experiment of resisting his own inward convictions, and this new impulse to ambition, combined with the strong temptation of variety in love, met the ardent young man weakened in moral principle and unfettered by laws of the land. The change wrought upon him was soon noticed by Clotel. Horatio, why is he falling for Gertrude? He is married to Clotel. Chapter 5. The Slave Market. What? Mothers from their children riven. What? God's own image bought and sold? Americans to market driven and bartered as the brute for gold. By Whittier. Not far from Canal Street in the city of New Orleans stands a large 2-story flat building surrounded by a stone wall 12 feet high, the top of which is covered with bits of glass and so constructed as to prevent even the possibility of anyone's passing over it without sustaining great injury. Let's pause for a moment at the word passing. So there's this building with glass on top of it to keep anybody from passing over it. And I'm not talking about literally passing over something, but just the idea of racial passing has been introduced through this word passing. So racial passing is when someone who is legally or self-described of one race lives, whether temporarily or permanently, as someone of a different race. Most typically, it is used to talk about light-skinned black people passing as white people. And so now we have this word passing introduced, and just here in the particular instance of the building that they're talking about, it is covered with bits of glass and so constructed as to prevent even the possibility of anyone's passing over it without sustaining great injury. So here Brown has introduced the idea that passing is dangerous and it will leave you with injury. Let's keep reading. Many of the rooms resemble cells in a prison. In a small room near the office are to be seen any number of iron collars, hobbles, handcuffs, thumbscrews, cowhides, whips, chains, gags, and yokes. A backyard enclosed by a high wall looks something like the playground attached to one of our large New England schools, and in which are rows of benches and swings. Attached to the back premises is a good-sized kitchen where two old negresses are at work, stewing, boiling, and baking, and occasionally wiping the sweat from their furrowed and swarthy brows. The slave trader Walker, on his arrival in New Orleans, took up his quarters at this slave pen with his gang of human cattle, and the morning after, at 10 o'clock, they were exhibited for sale. There, first of all, was the beautiful Althesa. We remember Althesa, yes, Clotel's sister. There, first of all, was the beautiful Althesa, whose pale countenance and dejected look told how many sad hours she had passed since parting with her mother at Natchez. There was a poor woman who had been separated from her husband and 5 children. Another woman, whose looks and manner were expressive of deep anguish, sat by her side. There, too, was Uncle James, with his whiskers off, his face shaved clean, and the gray hair plucked out and ready to be sold for 10 years younger than he was. We learned about that also in William Wells Brown's autobiography. And I think in this too. Toby was also there with his face shaved and greased, ready for inspection. The examination commenced and was carried on in a manner calculated to shock the feelings of anyone not devoid of the milk of human kindness. "What are you wiping your eyes for?" inquired a fat, red-faced man with a white hat set on one side of his head and a cigar in his mouth, of a woman who sat on one of the stools. "I suppose I've been crying." "Why do you cry?" "Because I have left my man behind." "Oh, if I buy you, I will furnish you with a better man than you left. I have lots of young bucks on my farm." "I don't want and will never have another man," replied the woman. "What's your name?" asked a man in a straw hat of a tall Negro man who stood with his arms folded across his breast and leaning against the wall. "My name is Aaron, sir." "How old are you?" 25. "Where were you raised?" "In Old Virginia, sir." "How many men have owned you?" 4. "Do you enjoy good health?" "Yes, sir." "How long did you live with your first owner?" 20 years. "Did you ever run away?" "No, sir." "Did you ever strike your master?" "No, sir." "Were you ever whipped much?" "No, sir. I suppose I did not deserve it." "How long did you live with your second master?" 10 years, sir." He's at least 30 now, and he told the guy he was 25. "Have you a good appetite?" "Yes, sir." "Can you eat your allowance?" "Yes, sir, when I can get it." "What were you employed at in Virginia?" "I worked in the tobacco field." "In the tobacco field?" "Yes, sir." "How old did you say you were?" "I will be 25 if I live to see next sweet potato digging time." "I am a cotton planter, and if I buy you, you will have to work in the cotton field. My men picked 150 pounds a day and the women 140, and those who fail to pick their task receive 5 stripes from the cap for each pound that is wanting. Now, do you think you could keep up with the rest of the hands?" "I don't know, sir. I expect I have to." "How long did you live with your third master?" 3 years, sir." "Ooh. Why, this makes you 33. I thought you told me you was only 25. Aaron now looked at the planter, then at the trader, and seemed perfectly bewildered. He had forgotten the lesson given to him by Pompey as to his age, and the planter's circuitous talk, doubtless to find out the slave's real age, had the Negro off his guard. I must see your back so as to know how much you have been whipped before I think of buying, said the planter. Pompey, who had been standing by during the examination, thought his services were now required, and stepping forward with a degree of officiousness, said to Aaron, "Don't you hear the gentleman tell you he want to examine your limbs? Come, unharness yourself, old boy, and don't be standing there." Aaron was soon examined and pronounced sound, yet the conflicting statement about the age was not satisfactory. Ooh, so we have already learned about falsifying age, breaking up marriages. What else are we going to read about? Fortunate for Althesa, she was spared the pain of undergoing such an examination. Mr. Crawford, a teller in one of the banks, had just been married and wanted a maidservant for his wife. Is that what he wanted, really? I'm dubious. And passing through the market in the early part of the day, was pleased with the young slave's appearance and purchased her, and in his dwelling the quadroon found a much better home than often falls to the lot of a slave sold in the New Orleans market. The heart-rending and cruel traffic in slaves, which has been so often described, is not confined to any particular class of persons. No one forfeits his or her character or standing in society by buying or selling slaves, or even raising slaves for the market. The precise number of slaves carried from the slave raising to the slave consuming states we have no means of knowing, but it must be very great, as more than 40,000 were sold and taken out of the state of Virginia in 1 year. That's heartbreaking. Known to God only is the amount of human agony and suffering which sends its cry from the slave markets and Negro pens, unheard and unheeded by man, up to his ear. Mothers weeping for their children, breaking the night silence with the shrieks of their breaking hearts. From some you will hear the burst of bitter lamentation, while from others the loud hysteric laugh denoting still deeper agony. Most of them leave the market for cotton or rice plantations. Where the slave whip ceaseless swings, where the noisome insect stings, where the fever demon strews poison with the falling dews, where the sickly sunbeams glare through the hot and misty air. Chapter 6. The Religious Teacher. What? Preach and enslave men? Give thanks, and rob thy own afflicted poor? Talk of thy glorious liberty, and then bolt hard the captive's door? By Whittier. The Reverend John Peck was a native of the state of Connecticut, where he was educated for the ministry in the Methodist persuasion. His father was a strict follower of John Wesley and spared no pains in his son's education, with the hope that he would one day be as renowned as the great leader of his sect. John had scarcely finished his education at New Haven when he was invited by an uncle, then on a visit to his father, to spend a few months at Natchez in the state of Mississippi. Young Peck accepted his uncle's invitation and accompanied him to the South. Few young men, and especially clergymen, going fresh from college to the South, but are looked upon as geniuses in a small way, and who are not invited to all the parties in the neighborhood. Mr. Peck was not an exception to this rule. The society into which he was thrown on his arrival at Natchez was too brilliant for him not to be captivated by it, and, as might have been expected, he succeeded in captivating a plantation with 70 slaves, if not the heart of the lady to whom it belonged. Added to this, he became a popular preacher, had a large congregation with a snug salary. Like other planters, Mr. Peck confided the care of his farm to Ned Huckleby, an overseer of high reputation in his way. The Poplar Farm, as it was called, was situated in a beautiful valley 9 miles from Natchez and near the river Mississippi. The once unshorn face of nature had given way, and now the farm blossomed with a splendid harvest. The neat cottage stood in a grove where Lombardy poplars lift their tufted tops almost to prop the skies. The willow locust and the horse chestnut spread their branches, and flowers never ceased to blossom. This was the parson's country house, where the family spent only 2 months during the year. The town residence was a fine villa seated upon the brow of the hill at the edge of the city. It was in the kitchen of this house that Currer found her new home. Ah, back to Currer, Clotel and Althesa's mom. Mr. Peck was, every inch of him, a Democrat, and early resolved that his people, as he called his slaves, should be well fed and not overworked, and therefore laid down the law and gospel to the overseer as well as to the slaves. "It is my wish," said he to Mr. Carleton, an old schoolfellow who was spending a few days with him, "it is my wish that a new system be adopted on the plantations in this estate. I believe that the sons of Ham should have the gospel, and I intend that my Negroes shall. The gospel is calculated to make mankind better, and none should be without it." "What say you," replied Carleton, "about the right of man to his liberty?" "Now, Carleton, you have begun again to harp about man's rights. I really wish you could see the matter as I do. I have searched in vain for any authority for man's natural rights. If he had any, they existed before the fall. That is, Adam and Eve may have had some rights which God gave them, and which modern philosophy, in its pretended reverence for the name of God, prefers to call natural rights. I can imagine they had the right to eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden. They were restricted even in this by the prohibition of one. As far as I know, without positive assertion, their liberty of action was confined to the garden. These were not inalienable rights, however, for they forfeited both them and life with the first act of disobedience. Had they, after this, any rights? We cannot imagine them. They were condemned beings. They could have no rights but the Christ's gift as king. These are the only rights man can have as an independent, isolated being. If we choose to consider him in this impossible position in which so many theorists have placed him, if he had no rights, he could suffer no wrongs. Right and wrongs are therefore necessarily the creatures of society, such as man would establish himself in his gregarious state. They are in this state both artificial and voluntary. Though man has no rights, and thus considered undoubtedly he has the power, by such arbitrary rules of rights and wrong as his necessity enforces. That is a lot to unpack. So, our friend here, Mr. Peck, who owns slaves, said his slaves should be treated well, and they should be taught the gospel, because everybody should be taught the gospel. And when his friend Mr. Carleton said to him, but what about liberty? And then Mr. Peck was like, slow your roll. Liberty isn't an inalienable right. What is an inalienable right anyway? Adam and Eve lost all of their rights when they got kicked out of the garden, so nobody has inalienable rights. And then he goes on and says, rights and wrongs are therefore necessarily the creatures of society, such as man would establish himself in his gregarious state. They are in this state both artificial and voluntary. So he's saying that society creates what is right and wrong, and that what is right and wrong is artificial and it's voluntary. You have to decide that, well, you have to volunteer that you're going to abide by what society says is right and wrong. So in this really long passage, he is basically absolving himself of any evil associated with slavery, because one, there are no inalienable human rights. There's nothing that all people deserve. And two, people are members of society and they follow whatever society says is right and wrong. And that is one of the ways slavery is being or was defended. Okay, so Carleton responds to Peck. I regret I cannot see eye to eye with you, said Carleton. I am a disciple of Rousseau, and I have for years made the rights of man my study, and I must confess to you that I can see no difference between white men and black men as it regards liberty. Nice. Now, my dear Carleton, would you really have the Negroes enjoy the same rights with ourselves? I would most certainly. Look at our great Declaration of Independence. Look even at the Constitution of our own Connecticut and see what is said in these about liberty. I regard all this talk about rights as mere humbug. That's Peck. So Carleton is like, look at our Declaration of Independence that espouses freedom and inalienable rights among these life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And Carlton is saying that should go for all people. But Peck is like, oh, do you really think so? Because I don't think black people and white people should have all the same things. And Carlton says, yes, I think so. And then Peck responds, I regard all this talk about rights as mere humbug. The Bible is older than the Declaration of Independence, and there I make my stand. The Bible furnishes to us the armor of proof, weapons of heavenly temper and mold, whereby we can maintain our ground against all attacks. But this is true only when we obey its directions as well as employ its sanctions. Our rights are there established, but it is always in connection with our duties. If we neglect the one, we cannot make good the other. Our domestic institutions can be maintained against the world if we but allow Christianity to throw its broad shield over them. So what he's saying is, the Bible doesn't say everybody should be free. The Bible just says that everybody needs the opportunity to learn about God. So Peck is saying his only responsibility is to teach his slaves the Bible, and then he's absolved from anything else. But if we so act as to array the Bible against our social economy, they must fall. Nothing ever yet stood long against Christianity. Those who say that religious instruction is inconsistent with our peculiar civil polity are the worst enemies of that polity. They would drive religious men from its defense. Sooner or later, if these views prevail, they will separate the religious portion of our community from the rest, and thus divided we shall become an easy prey. Why, is it not better that Christian men should hold slaves than unbelievers? We know how to value the bread of life and will not keep it from our slaves. That makes me slow blink. Really? That's what you think Jesus wants? So Carlton responds, well, everyone to his own way of thinking, said Carlton, as he changed his position. Oh, as he changed his position. And we got a lot of pages left in this chapter. I confess, added he, that I am no great admirer of either the Bible or slavery. My heart is my guide, my conscience is my Bible. I wish for nothing further to satisfy me of my duty to man. If I act rightly to mankind, I shall fear nothing. Carlton had drunk too deeply of the bitter waters of infidelity, and had spent too many hours over the writings of Rousseau, Voltaire, and Thomas Paine to place that appreciation upon the Bible and its teaching that it demands. During this conversation there was another person in the room, seated by the window, who, although at work upon a fine piece of lace, paid every attention to what was said. That was Georgiana, the only daughter of the parson. She had just returned from Connecticut, where she had finished her education. She had had the opportunity of contrasting the spirit of Christianity and liberty in New England with that of slavery in her native state, and had learned to feel deeply for the injured Negro. Georgiana was in her 19th year, and had been much benefited by a residence of 5 years at the North. Her form was tall and graceful, her features regular and defined, and her complexion was illuminated by the freshness of youth, beauty, and health. The daughter differed from both the father and his visitor upon the subject which they had been discussing, and as soon as the opportunity offered, she gave it as her opinion that the Bible was both the bulwark of Christianity and of liberty. With a smile she said, "Of course, Papa, I will overlook my differing from him, for although I am a native of the South, I am by education and sympathy a Northerner." Mr. Peck laughed and appeared pleased rather than otherwise at the manner in which his daughter had expressed herself. And there's a lot left in this chapter, so we're going to stop here for today. So thank you for joining me with Reading with Rashonda, and we'll keep on reading Clotel next time. Bye-bye.